And at that particular time, I was going through notes of the library, and the very first person, or the first organization, to receive this was the Ames Free Library for their books on nature. So I'm honored to follow that tradition. I would like to take about 20 minutes and share some parts of my experiences with Mrs. Parker, an extraordinary person. I might explain first that we came to Easton, when I say we, the Lukes, came to Easton in 1945. We were hired, or my dad was hired, to be Mrs. Frothingham's superintendent of Wayside. And you may not remember, most of you were too young, to remember that there were 4 yellow houses. In other words, if this was the mansion and over there's 138, there were 4 yellow houses on Elm Street, which were for the employees. And we moved in to 154 Elm Street. It was the house that was the closest. There was 154, 158, 160, and 164. And just before Mrs. Frothingham died in 1955, 164 became available. And my father had asked, could we move there so that each of my 3 brothers could have his own bedroom. It had 5 bedrooms in 164 Elm Street. It was a 9-room house, and obviously it gave us more space. After Mrs. Frothingham died, my dad was asked to stay and manage the property until they decided what to do. And as you all know, that in 1960, the town of Easton was given the house, the mansion, and 8.6 acres of land for $1, which left about 70 acres. And Mrs. Parker approached my father with 2 thoughts. First, she was going to buy the rest of the 70 acres for her grandchildren's grandchildren as an investment, which obviously included 164 Elm Street. And the other was, she was hoping that my father would come and be superintendent of 2 places. Her superintendent at that point had retired. Would he come and be responsible for Unity Close at Main Street, and she would rebuild the old greenhouse. I don't think anyone remembers that old greenhouse against the wall by the church. And he would be responsible for the property here. And she would build a new greenhouse. There wasn't one at the time. And he could have his plants there, and obviously also there would be a vegetable garden. And so my father obviously was thrilled, and we would have 164 Elm Street for the rest of their lives, with the heat paid, for a 9-room house. You can imagine what the heating bill was like, even in those days. Before I go any further, I want to share a story with you. It's 1955, and a little boy, 10 years old, named Wayne Hill, lived on Seaver Street. And Wayne loved to wander, and he would wander by the foundation frequently. And it's summer, his mother's birthday, he has no money, so why not pick some flowers near the foundation and give them to his mother? And just as he finished, a car came around the bend, and who was in it but Mrs. Parker? And he knew who she was, and he tried to explain, I'm sorry, my mother's birthday, I thought she liked the flowers. and he basically was nervous. He was almost crying. And she calmed him down, and she said, please tell your mother I said happy birthday too. And where do you live, what's your name, so forth and so on. That afternoon, there was a phone call at the Hill House, Mrs. Parker. And as soon as Wayne heard his mother say, yes, Mrs. Parker, thank you for the birthday greeting, he got very nervous. What kind of discipline would happen? No. She wanted to ask if he could come with her in her car to Langwater to see more flowers. He obviously loved flowers. At Langwater, there were azaleas. And would it be permissible to take this young boy, he's 10, over to Langwater, to Uncle John's place? He went. Beautiful, beautiful flowers. And then they went into the potting shed, and there was Uncle John, this is John S. Ames Sr., and refreshments, some of which he could take home for his mother to finish the birthday celebration from a few days ago. Wayne now lives in New Mexico, but he was here about a month ago. We went out for lunch, and his greatest memory of Easton is that Sunday afternoon when he went to the Langwater greenhouses and saw those flowers. And this is the kind of thoughtfulness that she had. Really, really extraordinary. Soon after my father retired, I sent a letter, 1976, to Mrs. Parker, representing the Historical Society. Could I interview her for some memories of Easton that I could share with the Historical Society at a meeting? She called. Yes, one condition. She would only talk about her first 18 years. And remember, by that time she was quite elderly. She said, please come at 3:30 on Friday. Hope you're not busy. Obviously, if I was busy, it was going to get changed quickly. And so I went at 3:30 that Friday. And at 4 o'clock, she stopped. And we had tea and cookies. And we continued that for about 10 Fridays. Sometimes her husband, called brother, was there. And in the middle, like the 5th Friday, she talked to me about our 2 young sons. What were their names? John and Jim. What were they like? Well, how do you describe your young children, except they're perfect? And so she said, next Friday, please bring John. And I don't know if you remember, because you were very, very young, but you went, you were on your best behavior. At 4 o'clock, you had milk and cookies. And the following week, Jim went. And she said that they were perfect children. So that was the compliment, etc. And we kept going. I finished putting it together in early September. And it was to be presented in October 27th at Oak Saints Memorial Hall. The hall was packed because they heard Mrs. Parker was coming. Not because I was reading something. Mrs. Parker was coming. And basically, not only was Mrs. Parker there, Mr. Parker was there, and obviously Sister Olivia Ames Cabot. And it was really a wonderful, wonderful night. If you know the booklet, or if you get the booklet, I didn't read the whole thing. I highlighted what I thought was important that you did in 45 minutes. As a teacher, you learn after a while, you can lose your audience. So you judge your time. Many people came forward and talked to her. And this is just after the NRT had the sheep pasture given. In other words, there was the harvest fair they talked about. They talked about being able to walk through the property. And Shep Williams was there. Some of you may remember Shep. He took the Antrim Hammer Shop, which was in front of Queesit, and made it into a beautiful home. The complication was part of the stream flows under that house, and so we had to put in a very special polyester. He's a landscaper, obviously. And Shep approached Mrs. Parker and me near the end and said, I have a publisher friend. Do you think you might like to have this published? And I mentioned that Mrs. Parker had an extraordinary number of pictures of her early time period. And Mrs. Parker said yes. And we had a couple of meetings putting the manuscript and the pictures together. This is the booklet, and she ordered several thousand copies. Now, while I think of it, this particular symbol, in which basically it says, other twig is turned, so the tree inclined. And it has the 4 children, whom I'll mention in a few moments. But basically, this was published by early December. We had an autograph signing session at the railroad station one Sunday in December. A lot of people were there, not just to get an autographed copy of this, but to actually say thank you to this woman who had given sheep pasture. It meant a great deal. And she'd been kind to other people in regard to the housing for the elderly, the Lutheran Church. And so it was a wonderful opportunity. I think she had more fun there than she had had for a long time to see this. Now, what about growing up at sheep pasture? Her parents were married in 1890. Her father grew up at Langwater. He's the oldest of the children of Frederick Lothrop Ames I. It seemed to have been a tradition that once an Ames got married, that the older generation would give some land. So the original parcel, I think about 5 acres, of sheep pasture was given to the young couple, Elise and Oliver, from Fred of Langwater. And I'll mention that tradition again in a couple of moments. The first child is Elise. She's named for her mother. Her mother was considered the most beautiful debutante of the 1880s. And I get a sense that Mrs. Parker or Elise felt she was in competition with her mother. Her mother was so beautiful. How do you, as a daughter, live up to that expectation? But 15 months later, another child. It has to be a boy. He's going to be Oliver. It's a girl. Her name, Olivia. Now, if you've got 2 Elises, how do you know when to call? So Elise is called E, all of her life, by her closest friends. Olivia is called O, so we now have E and O, but no boys. Third one is a boy, Oliver. And the 4th one will be Richard. And these 4 children, from what Mrs. Parker described, really got along very well. She mentioned that the girls in the early years dominated the boys, but by teenage time, the boys seemed to be holding their own. But they lived in 3 places each year. Can you imagine moving each season someplace else? We'll start here. Sheep pasture. This is their spring home. There will be a school teacher who will come in and homeschool, if you want to use that term. One of them, obviously, the lady, Miss King, who drew that design. And usually on Saturdays, if Dad was home, remember his father dies soon after they get married, and Oliver Ames takes over all the financial responsibilities of the company. He'll go out to the hickory tree, which is down there. He'll blow a whistle, and he'll start walking. And he expects the 4 children right in back of him. And that was a very special tradition of walking with Dad. He spent Saturday mornings with his children. And they called him Ma and Pa. Nothing fancy, Ma and Pa. And so you have these 6 people having a wonderful relationship. Now, where are they going in the summer? Well, you have to go to the ocean, right? The Atlantic. And actually, Oliver, according to Mrs. Parker, had actually bought some land on the Atlantic in what was called the Gold Coast. That is, Beverly is a large community, but on the ocean is Pride's Crossing and Beverly Farms. North of that is Magnolia, and beyond that is Manchester. Those 4 sections were called the Gold Coast, and wealthy people lived there. Mr. Ames bought 2.5 acres in Pride's for $125,000 before 1900, and had a mansion designed by Ogden Cardinal. This is where they spent their summers. And I want to stay there for a moment. When the Parkers are going to get married, they're going to get married in the summer, August 17th. You can't send out wedding invitations saying, come to the brides. They had to come up with a name, High Wall. So High Wall became the property that they had. Now, staying with that concept for a moment, Mr. Ames said to the newlyweds, I will buy you a house here in Pride's or somewhere else on this Gold Coast. He didn't use that phrase. Mrs. Parker was horrified. She did not want to live on the North Shore. There was only one place she wanted to live, and it began with E, Easton. No way would she live anyplace else. She was determined. And when she's telling me about this, I could just hear the anger in her. It was the only time in the whole experience I heard her angry that her parents thought that she wanted to live in Pride's Crossing. Okay. Fall, they come back here. And she described the fact that not only would the 6 move, but then there would be 12 household servants. So we're talking about 18 people moving with their luggage. There's a word right now that probably is not an in-word named caravan, but the whole concept of all of these people and their luggage moving, she said people would stare at us as if we were different. I might just mention before I go any further that there was a set of rules. For instance, at High Wall, they actually entertained William Taft and his wife when he was president. And I innocently said, what did you think of President Taft? He's the one that weighed over 300 pounds. And she looked at me in shock like, Hazel, youngsters did not be involved in evening get-togethers. We tried to peek out the window of the 2nd floor, and we weren't supposed to, but we did see a rather large man come in, whom we assumed was President Taft. But, I mean, there were rules, etc. They weren't showing off their 4 children. The children were upstairs. And in the winter, they moved to Boston. Now, Commonwealth Avenue was relatively new. It was a filled-in avenue after Civil War. There's no one Commonwealth Avenue. It's a square kind of thing. 3 through 15 were owned by Ameses. 3 is John S. Ames Sr., 5 is Mrs. Frothingham. The people from here were at 15, Commonwealth Avenue. So you could just imagine moving that many times, 4 times a year. But there was this real sense of togetherness. I didn't mention, but E and O wore identical clothing for their first 18 years. When you look at the pictures, you'll see both girls, obviously the same thing. She explained the first time she wore something different was at her debutante party, which was given by Mrs. Frothingham at 306 Dartmouth Street, Boston. She said it was different. Because otherwise you're looking at your sister and she's got the same things you have on. By the way, starting about the age that she was 13, they did have a governess. There's a playhouse that was out there that they thoroughly enjoyed. Sheep pasture was her favorite place. You really got that sense that that was really important. Yes, she enjoyed swimming in the Atlantic, but this was home. In fact, when she developed TB, soon after she got married, in those days, you had to be isolated. And what her dad did was build an L onto the sheep pasture mansion. And that's where she stayed for 3 months. And the only person that she would see was the rotating nurses. She would yell out the window to her husband or whomever else wanted to talk to her. But fortunately, 3 months was sufficient kind of situation. Now, as I listened to her, and I really enjoyed those Friday sessions, because you could tell they were so important to her, I kept thinking, this woman has seen so much tragedy in her life. How can she be so upbeat, if you want to use that colloquial expression? First, as we all know, her favorite brother, Oliver, is killed in World War I. I will be leaving 2 copies of each of these reminiscences. In this particular one, there's an article about some of the things that we were given by Mrs. Parker's grandson. But more importantly, there's a letter here written by the Major, William Donovan, Wild Bill he was called in military terms, in which he described how Oliver Ames was supposed to, stay back, but he followed Donovan to protect him. And the bullet that was intended for Donovan went through Oliver Ames. And this is the actual letter that was written to both the bride. Oliver had married the year before. He just had a daughter 3 weeks before he was killed. But the letter is so moving. And as I said, I'm leaving 2 copies for your library. Richard was a great musician. The parents thought that all children should learn to play the piano. They actually had 3 pianos at sheep pasture. The 2 girls couldn't put chords together, I think deliberately. What Oliver did was just bang the piano. Richard, he loved to play. In fact, there was a rule, he couldn't play till after breakfast. So after World War I, he spends a lot of time in Paris, and he will die there in 1935. So both of her brothers, he's buried in a musician's cemetery, so both of her brothers are buried overseas. William and Elise have 2 sons. One is William Amory, the other is Oliver. Oliver in 1943, he's in the military. His plane crashes at Hamilton Field, California. Again, tragedy. And 1967, this would be the 50th anniversary of their marriage. Amory had a special celebration for his parents, and a lot of people went. They did live on the North Shore. That always disappointed Mrs. Parker. But she, in fact, I think And our people can say she finally, or the estate finally sold that final 5 acres because she always hoped that somebody would come back, and nobody did. The party is sometime in August. Amory dies of natural causes September 11th. She loses both of her children. I cannot even process that. I mean, what she lived through and her commitment to Easton, even after that, was amazing. Sheep pasture was her dream. And obviously, Lynn can tell you the amount of time that was spent negotiating NRT and that kind of thing. And this is after she's lost both of her sons. You know, obviously her parents have died. That's part of the natural process. I'd like to share about one more family. It's called the Lopkowiches. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Lopkowiches. In the 1500s in Bohemia, which is Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic today, the Lopkowiches were the wealthiest family. They eventually will have, over the centuries, 10 castles. But as important as the ownership of 10 castles, they collected art. They collected music. The 7th Lopkowicz was actually the patron for Beethoven. So every original Beethoven piece was given to the Lopkowiches. So you can imagine the wealth in cultural items that they had. As Hitler is becoming more abrasive, the Lopkowiches will move, and this was true of a lot of other families, will move to London. It was supposed to be safe there. However, when the Germans started bombing in 1940, there was a tendency of each of these wealthy families to have a teenage boy of the family come here to the States or Canada. In other words, to continue the heritage. There was a real move, for instance, for Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, to come, but her parents wouldn't let her. Because there was a lot of pressure that the royal family should have their children come. All right, Martin Lopkowicz comes when he's 13. And he comes to the home of Sylvia Warren, a very wealthy lady in Dover. But Sylvia Warren and the Ameses had been friends forever, particularly Mrs. Parker. So Mrs. Parker sort of becomes the second mother, Miss Sylvia Warren being the first, for Martin Lopkowicz. Martin goes to Milton Academy, he goes to Harvard, he goes to law school, obviously becomes a lawyer, he marries, and is starting a family. And he's living in an apartment in Boston. No. Mrs. Parker said he needs a home, or they need a home. Where? Easton. So, 154 Elm Street, the house we'd moved out of, was vacant. And she talked to the Frothingham heirs. Could she buy 154? Yes. But you're not going to have wealthy people living right on the street. The house is moved back and refurbished. I think she spent an extraordinary amount of money making sure that house would be comfortable for a wealthy family. So for 11 years, they lived there, 1956 to 1967. Then the oldest boy is now old enough to go to Milton Academy. But you all know how far away Milton is, right? It's a long, long way. So she will buy them a house in Milton. And eventually they will inherit Miss Sylvia Warren's house in Dover. Okay, I just want to sort of leave 154 with somebody living in it. Soon after they leave, Mackenzie and Janine Smith, some of you may know them, rented and then bought it. and they have lived in it for more than 50 years. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, the next time you go along Elm Street and there's not much traffic, if you know where the gardener's cottage is, Richardson's famous gardener's cottage, look across the street and look back, and you'll see where the wealthy people lived. The very wealthy. I don't want to say anything about the Smiths, etc., but that's where they lived. All right. After, and of course, Mr. Lockwood becomes the lawyer and does all the legal work for the Parkers for the rest of their life, and actually maintains it even afterwards. In the 1991, the communists are forced out of Czechoslovakia, and Martin and his third son, William, will basically go back to Czechoslovakia and see if they can get their property back. Most of the castles you wouldn't want. They were dilapidated, falling apart, or maybe didn't exist. So they either had them torn down or sold them or whatever. There were 4. And what William decides to do is to stay there, not in one of the castles, but stay in Prague and develop or redevelop the cultural commitment of the Lockowiches. I've never heard where all of these documents were kept, the art, the books, thousands of books, Beethoven's manuscripts, but they were somewhere where they could be retrieved. And so what has become a major tourist, a cultural tourist attraction, is the Lobkowicz castles. Now, there are 2 people, or 2 couples anyway, who've been to the Lobkowicz castles. And I'm leaving a copy of the second reminiscence because the first person that went that I'm aware of was Bob Abbott. Some of you may remember him as a pharmacist. He started at Oxford Cleaners area and then moved to Southeastern until 1985. He was given a 50th anniversary trip by his family. They went to Prague. It was the last day. He thought, Lockwich, I've heard that name somewhere. And so they went. And standing at the door welcoming them was Prince William. He'd taken the name Prince back. And Bob said to me later, I almost said to him, did I fill prescriptions for you when you were living on Elm Street? But obviously you don't ask a prince that question. But Bob shares his story. And then my niece, Deborah Luke McPhee, went. And actually, she grew up at 158 Elm Street. And she was really too young to know the Lockowiches, but my oldest brother Jack did. But she went, and what happened was, interestingly enough, Prince William was back here in the States visiting his family. He always came back at least for a few weeks to see his parents. His dad died in 2014, but he still does. And just to conclude, in the Globe, October 26th, this year, was a picture, Gala to celebrate recovery of family art collection in Czech Republic. And there is William Lobkowicz and his wife, and they expected, it was going to be at the Charles Hotel in Cambridge, and they expected 300 to 400 people to attend this gala. So, again, the Lobkowiczes had an interesting effect on Easton. And I just want to say, I can't say enough about Mrs. Parker. I can remember thinking when I was doing some of the interviewing, how tragic her life was. And yet she didn't complain. One of the funny stories, while I think of it, and Lynn, you may have run into the same thing. If there was a town official that wanted something that she wasn't in favor of, the town official would come to the house. But with whom would he meet, or he or she meet? Mr. Parker. She would sit on the steps halfway up to the second floor and listen to the conversation. She had trained, I don't know if that's the right word, she encouraged her husband to say this, this, and this so that something wouldn't happen. And I guess that if he couldn't do it effectively, she would come down the stairs, suddenly remembering there was a meeting. But, I mean, she had a tremendous sense of humor in many ways. And I just think we are so fortunate to have this. And I'm also very fortunate to have this honor. Thank you.